Hello, everyone. My name is Madhavi Pundit, and I am a senior economist in the Economics Research and Development Impact Department of the Asian Development Bank. Welcome to the Asian Impact webinar. The ADB released its inaugural Asia-Pacific Climate Report in October 2024. This report is a new knowledge initiative to support Asia and the Pacific in combating climate change through policy reforms. This inaugural issue offers a comprehensive overview of the region's evolving climate landscape and examines various dimensions of the climate crisis. One key issue is public perception of climate change and public support for climate policies. The success of climate policies heavily depends on people's backing and acceptance, and as policymakers strive to accelerate climate action, it is essential to alleviate skepticism and build such support. So in July 2024, ADB conducted a survey of about 13,500 residents across 14 Asian economies. The primary objectives of the survey and analysis were 1. To assess levels of climate change awareness, perceptions and concern across different demographic groups and economies in developing Asia. 2. To investigate cross-country differences and the influence of local contexts. 3. To examine determinants of support for climate policies and climate-friendly individual actions. And 4, to provide policy recommendations based on our findings to inform effective policy design. The survey covered 4 key regions and 14 economies from East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. Now, this diversity is important because each region faces distinct climate vulnerabilities. For example, coastal risks and flooding in Southeast Asia, and agricultural disruptions, heat waves, and water scarcity in South Asia, and so on. All respondents were 18 years or older, accessed from an online panel managed by the survey company that we engaged, in this case, Dynata Singapore. We used English in India, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore, and local language translations for all other economies in our set. Now, the survey instrument was designed to gather comprehensive data while ensuring respondent engagement throughout the process. So the survey, lasting about 15 to 20 minutes, included 4 sections: demographic features, climate change perceptions, policy support, and behavioral interventions. Online surveys have many advantages as they can be quick, cost-effective, and they yield high response rates because of flexibility in time. But they also have limitations in coverage and potential statistical biases. I won't go into the details, but suffice to say that to ensure data quality, within the context and constraints of an online setup, we implemented multi-layered controls, including pilot testing, speed checks, demographic quotas, and data adjustments for accurate, balanced samples. But let me now jump to the results. So here are some key findings from the report on public perception of climate change in Asia. There is widespread concern across economies, with 91% of respondents considering climate change a very serious or fairly serious issue. 84% of respondents believe that climate change is already affecting them and their families or will within the next 10 years. 90% think that climate change is impacting people globally now or will within the next 10 years. And 64% are aware that their government has committed to taking action on climate change. So let's double-click on some of these results. The first is that clearly concern about climate change is widespread, with those considering it a very serious or fairly serious problem ranging from 84% in Malaysia to 96% in Vietnam. There are, however, variations across sub-regions and economies. Southeast Asia and South Asia have the highest level of concern, particularly in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Vietnam, where 70 to 81% of respondents consider climate change a very serious problem. In East Asia, perceived urgency is relatively lower, with 28 to 41% of respondents viewing it as a very serious problem. A second key result is that people feel that climate change is already affecting them. So as I mentioned, 84% say that it is impacting them now or will within the next 10 years. Again, this perceived personal impact varies across economies. In Pakistan, the Philippines, and India, about 70% of respondents report experiencing its effects. In contrast, fewer respondents, between 38 to 52%, in Hong Kong, China, People's Republic of China, and Kazakhstan share this view. And when asked about the global impact, 72% believe that climate change is affecting people now, and 17% think that it will in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, these differences across economies in perceived impact may reflect factors like geographic vulnerability or recent exposure to extreme weather events, public awareness, as well as economic sensitivity to climate impacts. A third key result is that respondents across economies are concerned about different climate change impacts. So hotter heat waves are a major worry in Pakistan, Malaysia, and India, while flooding is a significant concern in the Philippines, Vietnam, India, and the PRC. Unpredictable weather is a primary concern in Taipei, China, the PRC, and Vietnam. Now, other notable concerns include drought, damaging storms, and declining agricultural productivity. I think it is interesting that the top concerns that have been expressed by respondents, namely heat waves, flooding, and unpredictable weather, align closely with scientists' predictions for these regions. Now, in the survey, we focused on 3 climate mitigation policies: emission standards for building and appliances, low carbon or green infrastructure program, and carbon taxes. So in the questionnaire, respondents were asked to evaluate how their households would be affected in the short or long term, whether they supported or opposed the policies, and if opposed, to provide reasons. They were also asked to consider the potential impact on different segments of society. The highest support was for low carbon infrastructure programs, followed by emission standards, and lastly, carbon taxes. Again, this support for policies varied across economies. So low carbon infrastructure programs received majority approval, more than 70%, in Vietnam, India, and Kazakhstan. Emission standards were supported about 65% in India, Taipei, China, and Hong Kong, China, but only about a third supported them in Pakistan and Thailand. Carbon taxes received relatively high support in Vietnam, India, and the PRC, but less so in other Southeast Asian economies, with support below 50% in Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia. It is important to note that in the survey, we asked about awareness of policies. And as I mentioned before, only 64% of respondents across economies reported being aware of government actions to combat climate change. Additionally, many of these policies have not been implemented or are still in early stages of implementation, which may contribute to the lower levels of support that we observed. You may recall I mentioned that we asked a range of questions to gather information on respondents' socioeconomic characteristics, their income, their lifestyle, where they live, the way they travel, the way they consume news, etc. Now, this data was used in a weighted logistic regression analysis to identify what are the factors that influence support for the 3 climate policies. And let me just give you a snapshot of the results. Climate policy awareness came out as a very strong predictor for support of climate policies, although to varying degrees. So for emission standards represented by the blue dots, awareness has a significant effect in the PRC. For low carbon infrastructure, the orange dots, positive effects were notable in the PRC and the Philippines. While the effect is present for carbon tax, the green dots, it is generally weaker. Besides climate policy awareness, age effects are also pronounced. with the 55 and above group showing consistently higher support across all policies. Income effects also reveal interesting patterns, with households earning an annual income between $25,000 to $50,000, what we call the middle category, showing significantly higher support for all policies, of course, with exceptions. Public transport use came out as the fourth factor, which was positively associated with public policy, with climate policy support, suggesting that experience with sustainable practices might influence preferences for climate policy. So let's look at some of these results further. On age, as I said, the 55 plus group showed strong support for all climate policies, especially infrastructure and emission standards. Now, this may challenge assumptions that that older generations resist climate action, and in fact offers opportunities for engaging them in climate solutions. The middle group, 35 to 54 years, shows more selective support patterns with stronger backing for infrastructure development and emission standards, but less support for carbon taxation. The youth group, that is 18 to 34, generally support climate policies, but preferences varied a lot by economy, policy, and local context, suggesting again the need for tailored engagement. Income and climate policy support shows some interesting patterns as well. So households with income in the middle category consistently showed stronger support across all policy types. Higher income groups display more varied support, backing some policies while resisting others, especially carbon taxation. Lower income households express concerns about cost impacts across the board, and particularly for carbon pricing. Now, these patterns highlight the need for policies that address economic security and mitigate financial strain, particularly on vulnerable groups. Education plays a significant, though nuanced, role in shaping climate policy support. High education levels, particularly college and master's degrees, show a strong correlation with support for one of the policies, namely low carbon infrastructure. For the relationship between education and other policy types, that is, emission standards and carbon taxation, is more complex. Also, the effect of education varies across economies, indicating again that local context, demographics, and other factors influence this relationship. But interestingly and crucially, climate policy awareness often acts as a mediator between education and policy support, suggesting that targeted climate awareness programs could effectively build support regardless of formal education levels. Let me explain this. So we did a case study in the People's Republic of China using mediation analysis to explore how education influences support for green policies. Using the Barron and Kenny 1986 framework, we found that a college degree increases the probability of supporting carbon taxation by 8.7 percentage points. Now, this effect is split into a direct effect or influence of about 5 percentage points and an indirect influence of about 3.7 percentage points through increased climate concern. So, in other words, 41% of the correlation between education and support for carbon taxation is through the channel of climate change concern. So education, in effect, is playing a dual role in influencing climate support. It not only directly boosts support, but also reshapes views on climate change. Do note that over half of this influence is mediated by other demographic factors that could be income or occupation, etc. So highlighting the complex role of demographics as well in shaping policy preferences. There are other interesting heterogeneities. So our gender analysis highlighted key differences as well. Female respondents showed lower support for carbon taxation and low carbon infrastructure, but more willingness to adopt climate-friendly behaviors, particularly in household energy use. Now, these variations again emphasize the need for gender-sensitive policies that address different impact pathways and support mechanisms for men and women. While in general there is support for climate policies, Respondents who expressed opposition to these policies were asked to identify their main concerns. So, for emission standards for buildings and appliances, the primary issues were perceived ineffectiveness, additional costs, and potential disruptions, such as during implementation. In the case of low carbon infrastructure, many viewed it as an ineffective solution for climate change. Again, costs, possibly in terms of taxes or government spending, and disruptions caused by large infrastructure projects are key concerns. Regarding carbon tax, the dominant concerns were increased costs that would be passed on to consumers, particularly higher energy prices. There was also concern about potential job losses, possibly in carbon-intensive sectors, with respondents worrying about the social and economic implications of such transitions. We just looked at one policy, that is carbon tax. So we asked how the government could use the revenue generated from a carbon tax to increase support for the policy. And respondents had clear preferences. So the most popular option was helping low-income households cope with higher living costs, which suggests that financial relief for vulnerable populations is crucial in gaining support. Many also favored funding climate-related projects such as renewable energy and green technology, indicating a strong desire for climate action. The next two options were support for funding social services like healthcare and education, highlighting the importance of public services in gaining broader backing. And reducing other taxes for individuals came up as another option. So the point here is that while carbon taxation presents a complex policy challenge, the insights gathered from respondents can provide a clear direction for increasing support. Okay, the questionnaire also explored respondents' preferences for resilience and adaptation investments and highlighted strong support for flood protection, early warning systems, and climate resilient infrastructure. Now, while priorities varied locally, there was also support for water supply, coastal protection, agricultural adaptation, and conservation. Now, regarding financing, over half favored improving government efficiency through better tax collection and reduced corruption. International support was also seen as a key option. Next, we explored respondents' willingness to adopt behaviors that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the results highlight both opportunities and challenges for encouraging climate-friendly actions. So transportation habits show promise, with 54% willing to use public transport more and 13% already doing so. Energy efficiency measures are also popular, with 47% willing to replace inefficient appliances and 9% already having done so. Interestingly, dietary changes faced greater resistance across most economies. So perhaps the message here is that early intervention should focus on transportation and energy efficiency. Again, a lot of these results vary by demographic factors, particularly education and income. So let me wrap up my presentation with some key insights and strategies that can help build sustained support for climate policies. The first one is enhancing climate education. As I mentioned, policy awareness came up as the strongest predictor of support. So education should cover both the basics of climate science and the specifics of climate policies, including their mechanisms, goals, and potential benefits. Providing clear, accessible information helps individuals understand not only the intent behind these policies, but also how they directly impact their daily lives, their communities, and future generations. The second is tailored communication strategies. So highlighting personal relevance through tailored messages for varying levels of climate concern, knowledge, and economic factors is important. Also considering local context to ensure that the communication resonates with specific needs and priorities of different communities. Using a strategic mix of traditional and modern media channels, that is, TV, radio, and print on one hand, and social media and online platforms on the other, to address specific concerns. This approach will ensure that the message reaches a broader range of demographic groups, increasing engagement and support for climate policies. And thirdly, demonstrating tangible benefits and addressing equity. So clearly communicating the direct, tangible benefits of climate policies, such as improved health, economic opportunities, and enhanced quality of life. At the same time, addressing equity concerns are important through policies that are designed to be fair and inclusive, and especially for vulnerable or disadvantaged groups. Okay, this brings me to the end of my presentation. I will now hand over to Simon Pollock, Senior Communications Specialist, to introduce our esteemed panelists and lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhavi. That was great. That really deep dive into the results of the survey, I think, have set up a stage very well for an interesting discussion about climate change perceptions in Asia and the Pacific region. Just a quick digression. One of the reasons I think public perception is crucial in considering climate policies is based on my own experiences in a past life when I worked for what was then the Australian government's Department of Climate Change. The Australian government was one of the first national governments to devise an emissions trading scheme to tackle climate change, but it ended up being voted out of power in 2013. And I believe a key reason behind that was that the government, where I worked as a public servant, did not explain its climate policies adequately to the public. So I'd have to say that perfect policy does not inevitably equate to perfect perceptions. But now to our panel of experts, and I think we're very lucky to have such a diversity of experiences and ideas among these notable people. Firstly, we have Dr. Christina Kwauk. Christina is a US-based social scientist and policy analyst with expertise in the intersections of gender, education and climate change. She has published numerous policy papers, and by an incredible coincidence, which we just found out when we had discussions before this session, Christina actually conducted research in Samoa, where she not only met one of our other panelists, but she actually stayed at her home. And that other panelist is Dr. Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson, whose name in Samoan, which I've probably mangled completely, means Sky of Nine Nights. Langi is an award-winning Indigenous climate journalist and scholar from Samoa with over 20 years of experience reporting on the climate crisis for local, regional and international outlets. This includes AFP, Al Jazeera, Washington Post, Radio Australia, CNN, BBC and the Wall Street Journal. Next, we have Jose Ramon Albert. Albert is a renowned statistician and currently a senior research fellow at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Albert has worked in a variety of countries and written about a number of issues, not just about numbers, but about poverty alleviation, social protection, and climate change. He's also assisted in the Asia Perception surveys, which Madhavi was just explaining to us. And then we have Kartikeya Sarabhai. Kartikeya is founder and director of the Center for Environment Education in India. The Centre works in India and in various other countries to help create a sustainable future. His pioneering work in environmental education has led to a number of awards, both in India and overseas. So a great panel. I'm sure we'll have a really interesting discussion. I will kickstart the proceedings with a question for each panelist, but we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please put any questions you have at the Q&A box below. I see we've already got a few, which is great. If I could first turn to Albert, since your research was integral to the survey. Albert, could you tell us about some of the challenges in conducting what I believe is one of the biggest surveys in Asia on climate perceptions, and how did you address those challenges? Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Simon. You know, perception data is usually sometimes conducted, is collected either through qualitative data activities like focus groups, and key informant interviews, where you can probe more on the perceptions of people. But there's perception data can also alternatively be collected through large-scale quantitative surveys that can provide us a sense of reliability and broad representativeness. But that is actually the challenge, especially for surveys, an online survey like this, because that would, how do we ensure the representativeness across diverse populations? While online surveys would allow us to reach large numbers much more efficiently, they could also potentially skew the results towards urban, more digitally connected respondents. But in the case of the survey results presented by Madhavi, we address this through a methodology called statistical raking, a powerful technique that weights the respondents by demographics. Let me give you just a simple example. Suppose you have 2 male respondents and 1 female respondent, but we know the population is actually 50-50 male and female. So what we would be doing is give the female respondent twice the weight of each male respondent. That way, you're able to balance out the distribution, and we applied this principle across multiple demographic groups, not just sex, but age, education, and geographic location, to ensure the online results of the survey would better reflect the actual population distributions. This approach, combined with what was already suggested by Madhavi earlier, careful translation in local languages in certain contexts, and culturally adapted questions that help us overcome what we could be inherent biases of online surveys while maintaining the advantages of scale and efficiency.
Thank you, Albert. That was great. I mean, you've really shown some transparency on what to me is actually quite a black box in terms of determining what the survey results are, and then translating those numbers into looking at the real world. So thanks for that. Christina, I know you've done a lot of work on the fairly innovative area of education, climate change, and especially looking at young people. If I could just ask you to tell us about the connection between education and the shaping of perceptions and climate change, with an especial focus on the importance of young people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me here. Your morning, my tonight. I think what this study shows us is, of course, a very important reminder of the importance of education. Clearly the results highlighted the role that education plays in shaping concern for the environment, for climate, and then some correlations with support for different climate policies and climate actions. So in broader research in general, I mean, education consistently is one of the strongest predictor of climate awareness. So we know how important it plays in shaping people's concern, shaping people's knowledge of the problem, of solutions. I think there's even research that suggests that, one additional year of education can increase climate awareness by 9%. So, it's a very strong predictor in terms of concern and awareness. But I think what this study in particular raises for me is perhaps a cause for caution in terms of how we are assuming, or what we're assuming in terms of education, and what we're assuming in terms of climate policy and climate action. Because from an education perspective, education is an empty vessel. You can fill it however way you want. You can fill it with inclusive and ideas that promote social justice, or you can infuse it with extremely highly technical information and knowledge, or you can include it with misinformation or slightly factually inaccurate information. And so when we think about the importance of building at people's concern and awareness, we have to think about what kind of education. Because what also research is showing is that awareness and concern alone doesn't necessarily mean that we will arrive at the kinds of policy actions or the kinds of support for policy that is fair, equitable, just, inclusive. and that, there is cause for concern that if we're not being intentional about the kind of education that we are promoting, that concern can be co-opted by other ideologies, values, cultural affinities that might lead to climate policies that actually cause more harm for people and for planet. I think there's some fascinating work being done in the US context, looking at how right-wing eco-fascist concerns have taken over climate concern and directed and guided populations to support policy actions that are incredibly alarming and incredibly scary. So I think, when we think about the insights that this report has provided, we have to keep in mind, what kind of education are we talking about when it comes to building support, concern, and awareness about climate change, but importantly, how that educational process leads people from concern and awareness to the types of climate policies and climate actions that promote social inclusion, equity, equality, justice, and fairness. So I think that's something that really struck me from just hearing the report's findings again and reflecting a little bit on how education is really critical, but we have to think really critically as well about what kind of education, especially among young people who will be experiencing the impacts of climate change the most.
Yes, I guess they'll be experiencing that intergenerational justice or injustice. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it shows we can't just sort of sit back and let the scientific facts on climate change speak for themselves. Education is obviously going to be a very important part of that. If I could move to our other panelist, Langi. As you may be aware, there was insufficient time in conducting research for the perception survey to cover the Pacific Island countries adequately, and I'm sure there'll be interest in doing that in the future. But just with your perspective, I'm wondering how you see as important emerging themes about climate change perceptions among Pacific Island countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and Talofalava to everyone who is tuning in. Thanks for this opportunity to provide some insights from a Pacific Island perspective. This report is so important, and it would be great to see that being done in the Pacific Islands as well. There's some really good data available on the impacts and the cost of the climate crisis on the Pacific. It'd be good to see how this translates to perception. In terms of what you asked, Simon, this is such a complex question in regards to the perception of Pacific Islanders, mainly because it's such a diverse region. You've got atoll nations with different needs, and then you've got, larger, more developed Pacific Island countries such as Fiji and so forth, who are a lot more developed in their climate policy and their climate work on the ground. So it's harder to really put a blanket on the perception by Pacific Islanders. But I'll refer you to, we did a perception survey in Samoa about 5 years ago on the perception of high chiefs in the villages and how they felt about the climate crisis. And what's interesting is that there's this sense of ownership and guilt among locals in the rural communities that it's our fault, that it's their fault, that it's their mistreatment of the land and dishonoring nature that has resulted in the climate crisis, which really speaks to the perception and the values of Pacific Islanders spiritually and emotionally, which is that we are collective and we are responsible for the future of our own communities, villages, and tribes, so to speak. So the perception there really varies. You have the urban elite and the educated and those who are exposed internationally. With that grouping, the perception is the existential threat and the urgency of the climate crisis because they are aware of the science and the implications on our islands. And then there's the intergenerational responsibility that the high chiefs that we spoke to and many elders in the Pacific feel that we have, this responsibility to make sure that you can hand over the land and the future of our countries to future generations without jeopardizing how they can survive off the land. So it's such an important question, and I would love this survey, to be replicated across the Pacific Islands, because then you can really capture how island nations and especially atoll nations and young people in atoll nations have a far superior awareness and a sense of justice for what they deserve as the future inhabitants of those islands, whether or not they will be there. So there's also this really strong movement of youth across the Pacific to really take ownership of the future and push their governments to really act in a way that holds high-emitting countries into account. Then there's also the issue of adaptation and resilience, communities emphasizing the importance of resilience through traditional knowledge, sustainable practices, and innovative adaptation strategies. And like I said, climate justice and equity governs a lot of the perceptions in the Pacific, whether that be the chiefs in the villages, the farmers, the fishermen and women, or the decision makers. It's a complex question, but across the Pacific, there is a sense of injustice and a great need to hold those who are responsible for these emissions to account. And also a very good time to remind that Pacific Islands are only responsible for 0.03% of global emissions, yet face the consequences first and worst. So it is important to note that the islands who are on the front lines of the climate crisis are also the last to be asked what the solutions are that they need to sustain our homes and our communities into the future.
Thank you, Langi. That was super interesting. I mean, it just shows you that we shouldn't stereotype Pacific Island countries. Neither should we stereotype other groups of people, countries, communities when we look at their perceptions towards climate change. Thanks very much for that. And also to really accentuate the strong role of Pacific Island countries in acting as the sort of the consciousness, I guess, of humanity in some ways, since, as you said, they're the ones that will bear the brunt of climate change, but they're the ones who are least responsible. And it's quite somehow disturbing to hear that the tribal leaders actually see some role or some feeling of guilt themselves when they sort of have had so little input into that problem. Okay, so if we could go on to the next speaker, Kartikeya. I know that you've had lots of experiencing working the grassroots and working with governments and various other stakeholders in India and other countries too, I believe. Just wondering if you'd tell us about your experiences in raising climate change awareness in India, particularly the use of a climate change action train, which you have mentioned before. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think this survey throws a lot of light, and it will be very useful. I just speak about this particular initiative. A science train was launched it was an Indo-German project, and when it started, and it was on a science thing, and then it was felt that we could use this very effectively for creating awareness on climate change. And so the train was remodeled. It's an 16-coach train, but 8 of them were meant for this climate change. And we went through the climate change, understanding climate change, impact, adaptation, mitigation, and finally what action people could take. That one photograph you see with the globe with a thermometer in it was just an example of the type of exhibits which we used. People often question, how does just a small change of 1.5 degrees Celsius, how can it make such a difference when the temperature morning till evening is more than that? And what we showed was that when you have fever you cannot be effective, and so on. You can see a photograph of people inside the train, and there is a map of India showing how it went around. Each year it went around 19,000, 20,000 kilometers, stopping at 64 stations in the first year and 68 in the second, and about 5 million people were covered. We can take the slide out now. You can remove the slide. Yeah. So this train emphasized not so much supporting policy as much as taking action. And in fact, the train initially was called Climate Change Special, but then it was changed to Climate Action Special. And so the whole emphasis of the train is how individuals can act and be efficacious in what they do. Now, students would come and they would often wait for over an hour before they actually got into the train. And so we had a lot of platform activities. There were volunteers and science people doing little games and things. The train itself had 2 compartments, which were for a laboratory and an action place. Only some of the students could go into it. What was very interesting was that we did a survey 3 months after people had visited the train. And we were lucky to find that some schools had sent one of their divisions to see the train, but the other one had not gone. So you had a perfect control situation. And we found that these people who had visited the train showed 30% more awareness than the one who hadn't. Now we said, how can that possibly be true for a 1.5 hour visit? How can that change happen? And the reason seemed to be that those who had gone to the train, it had sparked something in them. So when they came back to the school, they had continued activities over those 3 months. And that was what was creating the impact. So if we had done the survey immediately afterwards, we might not have found that. But because we didn't get funding for a while, we did the survey 3 months later. And that gave us this insight that certain things like this really spark imagination. You should also know that over the last 20 years, India has made it compulsory to do environmental education in all schools at all levels. And from next year onwards, there will be a special subject on environment and climate change, which is a compulsory subject for all 10th grade, which is 16-year-olds throughout the country. So the train really develops on top of this. And I think the survey was very interesting in showing relatively low awareness on impacts on agriculture, unpredictable weather in India. And I think it's a very significant one, because I think people do know that it creates heat waves and it creates drought, but it does not, the effect is not trickled down yet. So realizing how it affects them and how it's likely to affect them, and that sort of indicates what we need to do next in India, of showing how it's going to affect their lives more directly. If you see the perception of how it affects others is more than if it affects themselves. And I think the survey results can be used very effectively in developing our future strategies. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. We've got a lot of questions here, which is great. We've got one that's from Arthur asking about how do we respond to the issue of climate change that starts from household or small family activities? Because most climate change is caused by human activities that are more broader reaching. Then we've got another one here asking, thank you very much for the initiative. Just wondering, how do you advocate politicians who change policies to support free market economy, neglecting climate change policies, priorities, focusing only on economic growth and deregulation? So I guess, these two questions somehow are a bit similar in that you can look at the sort of activities that we take ourselves as hopefully responsible citizens, but then how do we reconcile that with the governments and the businesses who have a lot bigger impact on how climate change and the degree of climate change which is happening? So I guess the question there, in looking at perceptions, how do we address that when people may sort of look at different politics, different businesses, and they feel that they're not really taking adequate climate change action? How then should they approach their own approach to their own attitude towards climate change? So how do you reconcile the private with the public? In terms of perceptions, maybe Christina, you might have a view on that, since it comes towards perceptions of different segments of society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that perhaps a part of that question that strikes me as particularly important is bridging the gap between what people expect of their governments in terms of actions to be taken and then what actually happens. Because I think part of what the survey results showed us was an overwhelming belief that governments should be taking action. And I think we have simultaneously surveys, especially among young people around the world, that suggest that young people believe that they have been betrayed by their governments because their governments have not been acting and not been taking enough ambitious action on climate change, and rather than pursuing other sorts of policies that are antithesis to taking action on climate. And so if we cannot reconcile that difference in terms of public perception around the role of government in pursuing ambitious climate policy, and then the actions that are happening and the desire among people to see that, we have at our hands, ripe situation for discontent, dissatisfaction, anger. We know from surveys of young people the degree of climate anxiety that is felt, that it will be an enormous issue as the impacts of climate change continue to mount and become more frequent and intense. So when we're thinking about, what can households be doing, what should governments be doing? I mean, households, unless we're achieving a scale, a massive scale, those individual household actions will not compare to the level, to the impact that actions at a systems level can take. So I think we really need to ensure that we are, yes, trying to do what we can to promote actions, sustainable actions at a household level, but at the end of the day, it's our governments, it's our systems, and it's the people's belief and perception that governments need to take action that we need to be focusing our attention on. So thanks.
Great, thank you. A lot of food for thought there. We have another question about the connection with health. So from Imi, who quite liked Madhavi's presentation. So congratulations, Madhavi, on that. So one of the key areas that climate change is significantly impacting is the health sector. I was wondering if any specific surveys or studies have been conducted to assess how climate change is affecting individuals in poor health, particularly in terms of vulnerability to climate-related risks. Albert, is that something you've been delving into? I believe you've been looking at various areas of development aside from climate change.
Yeah, well, for this survey, that as far as I understand, as far as I remember, there weren't quite specific questions on health vulnerabilities of respondents. That's actually important, and probably one of the things that need to be done in the future, because naturally there different people would be having their own vulnerabilities, and not only vulnerabilities but their awareness, climate, their experiences, their own perceptions on what governments are doing or not doing are also different, depending on the health vulnerabilities, and more broadly, it's not just health vulnerabilities, but all types of vulnerable and marginalized sectors. But that becomes the main struggle now when you're doing these kinds of large surveys, because surveys can usually capture broad populations, and they may not necessarily be able to zoom down to specific rare kinds of vulnerable sectors of the population.
Okay, thanks. And just on the question of surveys, we've got a question from Joe Chung, who's asking if the survey data is very insightful for policymakers, also for academic researchers. I was just wondering if the data, he's wondering if the data, or she's wondering if the data will be open for access? So is it publicly available?
As far as I know, not yet now, but then that's probably something that the ADB team will have to decide at some point whether that there will be microdata access to the survey. And I agree to the extent. I mean, as a researcher myself, I mean, I always like to have data available that will enable me to be able to write a couple of policy research studies. Thanks.
Okay, I admire your ability to understand the data. And we got a question, Langi. You've really brought out the differences in perceptions amongst Pacific Island people, but all sorts of people. So we've got a question here, asking what strategies can be implemented to enhance public education and awareness about climate policies to bridge gaps in support across different income and education levels. So just like looking at those differences in society. I wonder if you had some thoughts on that.
Sure. Thank you, Simon. I think it's really important to note that information and the way that we communicate to our communities really differ depending on where the community is at. So I speak from my knowledge and awareness of how the Samoan audiences and communities receive information. When you go into the village, there's already existing mechanisms of communicating or relaying information to a village that is most effective and will be well received by them. And that's either going through the village council, going straight to the women's committee, or going through the untitled men's group or taulile'as. Now, that should apply at the national level as well, depending on how and what changes you want to make and the policies you want to shift. I'll take an example of the Samoa Ocean Strategy. The way that the consultations for that in looking at ocean conservation was that it went through the relevant ministry, the National Environment Sector Committee, and then from there it went to the community through the nonprofits, through the village councils, and other non-government organizations in partnership with the government. By doing that, you're actually speaking directly to the grassroots to inform policy. Often when we have, and I see a question here that is coming through from about the sustainability of climate programs and projects. Often when you have international developments bring in funding, so say for instance with the Green Climate Fund, I've reported extensively on these issues, is that it is informed in a way by community perspectives and perceptions, but the implementation might be a little bit too far removed from the community, what with bureaucracy and what have you. So this is understandable. But bridging that gap then requires really good communication and also community partnerships. And what I found in Samoa and also in my work in Vanuatu, Tonga, and Fiji is that maintaining those relationship with the local communities and utilizing the communication channels of those communities is the most effective way of doing it. So inviting a chief or a women leader from the village to come sit in a conference room in Suva or Apia may not necessarily be the most effective way of consulting and seeing what the perception is of that community. But going into the village and spending time with them and understanding what the issues are so that you can translate that to a very well-informed policy intervention is probably the most effective way of doing so. I hope this answers the question, Simon.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. These are all very in-depth questions. We could spend, the whole hour just, I think, picking apart many of these different issues. Just on another question, maybe, Kartikeya, if we could get back to you. There's a question here talking about awareness of climate change is important as it can lead to habit and lifestyle change, but regulations tend to be more effective. Do you observe differences between countries or communities where regulations are in place to enhance climate action across all incomes, gender, and age groups? So I guess it's looking at lifestyle changes, which is something that we can do ourselves, and looking at how that matches with regulations, which are government controlled.
I think there's not a distinction between promoting individual action and regulation. for instance, we have regulation or something on urban mobility. We want more people to travel by buses, public transport, trains, and others. And there was initial resistance because some of the roads were cordoned off. Cars used to be jam-packed while you see a public road next to it, which is completely empty, where a bus goes by, and people would have anger on it. But today, people understand why that is done. You ban plastic bags, for instance. Now, just the ban alone doesn't work unless the people also act on it, because otherwise you will find that these policies don't work. So I don't see this distinction. I think the education and individual action enhances the effectiveness of policy and also supports it. Now, public awareness is also changing policy, especially at local levels. We have village level committees, we have city level committees where people, either through nonprofits or through student groups or others, effect policies and say these things should be done. So I'm seeing it that you need to have these two together. You need policy, but you need people understanding why that policy was put in the first place and why you are supposed to support it. But I think the two go together.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We're getting close to the end of the session. Got 5 minutes to go. Just one question I'd like to ask is, considering that we have some evidence of climate action fatigue, so we see different different countries where governments are facing public opposition to converting ideas into workable climate policies. I'm just wondering if I could just ask for a comment on that, just a quick comment on that from one of you. Thanks.
Simon, I'd like to say something here in relation to the fatigue. I think it's really important to note that for Pacific Islands, there's no luxury of denial, fatigue, or inaction. You'll find that largely in the Pacific, we don't necessarily question that climate is happening. The anxiety does not exist because the guilt is not there. So if there is anxiety, it is 5 days before the cyclone hits. But it's not on our island's going to disappear, because there's just the business of living and surviving each day. So the fatigue piece is not necessarily something that is there or a problem, because everyone in the community continues to work together to come up with ways to survive. It is, at the end of the day, a survival issue for Pacific Islanders.
Okay, great.
And if I can just quickly say that businesses are now not seeing this as a sort of a short-term thing. I think they're changing the way things are being done. And they've all got net zero targets, which are even faster than what the government prescribes. So I think you're seeing a shift now of these things becoming a part of life rather than something where you have fatigue on.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm getting the wind up from my colleagues behind the scenes. So I think we'll have to wrap up. I feel it's a bit embarrassing because we've got still a lot of questions from our online audience, which we haven't been able to answer. Hopefully we'll be able to delve into this topic at a later date. But thank you all to our online audience for bring forward all those great and stimulating questions. And also a big thank you to our panelists for taking the time to share their views. It's a complex topic and we could spend a long time delving into many different areas, but thanks for bringing all your insight. So thank you to Christina Kwauk, Lagipoiva, Cherelle Jackson, Jose Ramon, Albert, Kartikeya, Sarabhai. Much appreciated. It's been a great and very interesting session. And finally, in closing, I'd just like to let you know about another ADB upcoming Asia Impact webinar, which is on mapping the unpaid care work economy in Asia, which will be held on 29th of January, 9 to 10 a.m. Manila time. Please do check the Asian Impact webinar page and ADB Chief Economist's X account for more details. And thank you very much. Thanks, panelists. That was a really stimulating conversation, and wishing all our online audience a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be. Thank you.